we think we know the story of Pearl Harbor. It's a simple one, a surprise attack, a sleeping nation, a day of infamy that pushed America into a world war. But the real story is never that simple. It's filled with missed signals, strange coincidences, and incredible acts of bravery that get lost in the big picture. What if the first shots were fired an hour before the planes arrived? What if a single radio operator's warning had been taken seriously? The attack wasn't just an event, it was a million tiny moments, a chain of decisions and mistakes that changed the world forever. The story you know is just the beginning. Number 21. Why were the American commanders so unprepared? It's easy to blame the commanders on the ground. Admiral Husband E. Kimmel, commander of the Pacific Fleet. Lieutenant General Walter C. Short, commander of the Army's Hawaiian Department. History painted them as incompetent. They were relieved of command just 10 days after the attack. The Roberts Commission, quickly found them guilty of dereliction of duty. It was a neat and tidy answer for a shocked and angry country. But the truth is more complicated. Kimmel and Short were operating on bad information. They received intelligence from Washington, but it was often vague. Warnings of Japanese aggression were constant, but they pointed towards Southeast Asia, places like the Philippines or the Dutch East Indies. Hawaii was considered a safer base, a place for training and resupply, not a frontline target. Their primary concern, based on directives from Washington, was sabotage. They worried about local Japanese sympathizers blowing up fuel tanks or ships in the harbor. This fear of sabotage directly led to one of the biggest tactical errors. General Short ordered the Army's planes to be parked wingtip on the airfields. This made them easier to guard against saboteurs on the ground. But it also made them perfect targets for bombers from the air. When the Japanese planes arrived, they found neat rows of American aircraft ready to be destroyed. They didn't have to hunt for them. They were lined up like bowling pins. Admiral Kimmel did the same with his ships. He kept them moored tightly in the harbor. It was standard procedure for a peacetime weekend, but it created a target-rich environment. Both men had requested more resources. Short wanted more anti-aircraft guns and long-range patrol planes. Kimmel wanted more ships and better reconnaissance. Their requests were often denied or delayed. Washington had priorities, and Europe was high on the list. The Pacific was seen as a secondary theater, at least until it wasn't. The book At Dawn We Slept by Gordon W. Prange is a massive, detailed account of these failures. Prange spent decades interviewing American and Japanese participants. He concluded that the failure was systemic, not just personal. It was a failure of imagination at every level, from the intelligence analysts in Washington to the commanders in Hawaii. Subsequent investigations over the years have softened the view of Kimmel and Short. In 1995, a Pentagon study concluded that higher-ranking officials in Washington also shared responsibility for the disaster, as they had failed to provide Kimmel and Short with critical intelligence. In 2000, the U.S. Senate passed a resolution exonerating both men, requesting they be posthumously restored to their full rank. It was a symbolic gesture, but it acknowledged that they were scapegoats for a much larger failure. They were men doing their jobs based on the information they had. The information was just wrong. So what do we still not know? To what degree did political maneuvering in Washington intentionally keep Kimmel and Short in the dark to avoid revealing code-breaking secrets? Was there a smoking gun intelligence report that was seen by top officials but never sent to Hawaii? And if they had received a clear warning, could they have realistically mounted a defense in time? Or would it have just meant more American sailors died at sea instead of in the harbor? At number 20, did the first shots of the war happen before the planes arrived? Yes, the first American shots of the Pacific War were fired more than an hour before the first bomb fell on Ford Island. It happened in the pre-dawn darkness, a strange and confusing encounter that was a critical missed warning. The story centers on a small four-stack destroyer called the USS Ward. It was an old ship, a relic from World War I, on routine patrol at the mouth of Pearl Harbor. Its captain was Lieutenant William W. Outerbridge. He was new to the job. He had only taken command of the Ward 2 days earlier. At around 3:57 a.m., the minesweeper USS Condor spotted something in the water. It looked like a periscope. The Condor signaled the Ward. Sighted submerged submarine on westerly course, speed 9 knots. Submarines weren't supposed to be in this restricted area. Outerbridge brought his crew to general quarters, but they couldn't find anything in the dark. For a couple of hours, things were quiet. Then, at 6:37 a.m., they saw it. A small, strange-looking submarine was trailing a U.S. cargo ship, the Antares, trying to sneak into the harbor behind it. This was a Japanese Type A Ko-Hyoteki-class midget submarine. Japan had launched 5 of these two-man subs from larger mother submarines about 10 miles off the coast. Their mission was to penetrate the harbor defenses and torpedo the American battleships. The sub spotted by the Ward was one of them. Outerbridge didn't hesitate this time. He ordered his crew to open fire. The first shot from their 4-inch gun missed. The second shot hit the submarine's conning tower right at the waterline. As the Ward passed over the sub, it rolled a pattern of depth charges. The submarine was destroyed. At 6:53 a.m., Outerbridge sent a coded message to Naval Headquarters. "We have attacked, fired upon, and dropped depth charges upon submarine operating in defensive sea area." The message was received, but it was treated with skepticism, not alarm. False submarine sightings were common, and the message was passed up the chain of command slowly. There was confusion, delays. By the time the message reached Admiral Kimmel's staff, it was after 7:30 a.m. They decided to wait for confirmation before sounding a general alarm. The confirmation never came. At 7:55 a.m., the first Japanese planes appeared in the sky over Pearl Harbor. The warning from the USS Ward was lost in the noise. For decades, the story was just that, a story. Some even doubted it happened. But in August 2002, the Hawaii Undersea Research Laboratory found the sunken midget sub almost exactly where the Ward reported sinking it. It had a shell hole in the conning tower, confirming Outerbridge's report. What do we still not know? What happened to the other 4 midget subs? One ran aground, and its pilot, Kazuo Sakamaki, became the first Japanese prisoner of war. Another was found in 3 pieces in the harbor after the attack. But what about the other 2? Did they fire their torpedoes? Did they hit anything? And the biggest question, what if the Ward's message had been treated with the urgency it deserved? If an alarm had sounded at 7 a.m., could the ships have raised steam? Could the anti-aircraft guns have been fully manned? Could a few more fighter planes have gotten into the air? At number 19, what if Japan had launched a 3rd wave? The Japanese attack on Pearl Harbor came in 2 distinct waves. The first wave, with 183 planes, struck at 7:55 a.m. The second wave, with 171 planes, hit about an hour later. They did incredible damage, but the man who led the attack, Commander Mitsuo Fuchida, flew over the harbor and saw that the job wasn't finished. The most important strategic targets were still intact: the massive oil storage tanks, the submarine base, the naval repair yards and dry docks. Fuchida radioed back to his commander, Admiral Choichi Nagumo, on the aircraft carrier Akagi, recommending a 3rd strike. The debate on Nagumo's flagship was intense. Some of his staff, including the brilliant young planner Minoru Genda, argued strongly for a 3rd wave. They knew that destroying the infrastructure of Pearl Harbor was just as important as sinking the battleships. The Pacific Fleet relied on Pearl Harbor's fuel and repair facilities. The oil tanks held about 4.5 million barrels of fuel. Without that fuel, the surviving American ships, especially the aircraft carriers, would have been forced to retreat to the west coast of the United States. It would have crippled American naval operations in the Pacific for a year or more. Some historians, like the military analyst Hanson W. Baldwin, have called Nagumo's failure to launch a 3rd wave one of the great strategic blunders of the war. But Nagumo was a cautious man. He was a battleship admiral, not an aviator, and he was skeptical of carrier warfare. He had several reasons for his decision. First, the element of surprise was gone. A 3rd wave would face a fully alerted American defense. Anti-aircraft fire had been much heavier during the 2nd wave than the first. He had already lost 29 planes. He didn't want to risk losing more. Second, he didn't know where the American aircraft carriers were. They were his primary targets, and they weren't in the harbor. He worried they might be somewhere nearby, waiting to launch a counterattack on his own fleet. Third, his planes would have to land on their carriers at night, a risky maneuver. Finally, his fleet was at the extreme limit of its logistical range. They needed to refuel. He had accomplished his main mission to sink the battleships and buy Japan time to expand its empire in Southeast Asia. He decided not to risk his precious carriers for uncertain gains. He gave the order to turn for home. The decision was a massive strategic gift to the United States. The repair facilities at Pearl Harbor were quickly put to work. The ships that seemed like total losses were patched up, refloated, and sent back to fight. The submarine base was untouched, and American submarines would go on to cripple the Japanese merchant marine. And the fuel tanks were full. The American carriers, when they returned to port, could refuel and rearm and go on the offensive. The war in the Pacific would be a carrier war, and thanks to Nagumo's caution, America still had the bases and the fuel to fight it. So, what are the big unknowns? If Nagumo had launched a third wave, how many more planes and pilots would he have lost? Would the damage to the fuel tanks and shipyards have been as catastrophic as predicted? And how would American strategy have changed? Would the war have been prolonged by another year? Or would a more devastating attack have galvanized American public opinion even further, leading to an even more ruthless and rapid prosecution of the war? Number 18. How did Japan build a torpedo that could work in shallow water? The plan to attack Pearl Harbor had a huge technical problem. The harbor is very shallow, averaging only about 40 feet deep. Standard aerial torpedoes, when dropped from a plane, would dive deep into the water before leveling out. In a place like Pearl Harbor, they would simply plunge into the muddy bottom and get stuck. The Americans knew this. They considered a torpedo attack on the ships moored in the harbor to be impossible. Their own tests had shown it couldn't be done. They even installed anti-torpedo nets on some of their ships, but they were confident that the main defense was the harbor's shallow depth. The Japanese knew this too. Their top naval planners, including Minoru Genda, realized that without effective torpedoes, the attack would lose much of its punch. The bombs dropped from high-altitude bombers were not accurate enough to reliably hit and sink armored battleships. Dive bombers were more accurate, but their bombs were smaller. The real ship killer was the torpedo. So they had to solve the problem of the shallow water. The task fell to Japanese naval engineers. They worked relentlessly in the months leading up to the attack. They tried dozens of ideas. Finally, they came up with a simple but brilliant solution. They attached small wooden fins to the back of their Type 91 aerial torpedoes. These fins acted like the feathers on an arrow, stabilizing the torpedo as it fell through the air. More importantly, they gave the torpedo extra lift in the water, preventing it from diving too deep. The torpedoes were modified to run at a depth of only 33 to 39 feet. The Japanese torpedo bombers were also trained to fly extremely low and slow when they dropped their weapons, further reducing the dive angle. This innovation was a closely guarded secret. It was a technological breakthrough that made the impossible possible. On the morning of December 7th, the American sailors on the battleships watched the Japanese torpedo planes come in. They were flying so low that some witnesses said they could see the pilots' faces. They saw the torpedoes drop into the water and were shocked when they didn't just sink. These special torpedoes ran true. They slammed into the hulls of the USS Oklahoma, the USS West Virginia, and the USS California. The Oklahoma took at least 5 torpedo hits in a matter of minutes. The massive battleship capsized, trapping hundreds of men inside. The torpedoes did exactly what they were designed to do. They blew huge holes in the ships below the waterline, causing massive flooding. The technological failure of the Americans was a failure of imagination. They assumed that because they couldn't do it, no one could. What do we still not know? How much did Allied intelligence know about the advances in Japanese torpedo technology before the attack? Were there any reports or rumors that were dismissed as impossible? We know the British had successfully used aerial torpedoes in a shallow harbor attack at Taranto, Italy in 1940, an event the Japanese studied closely. Why didn't American planners see the parallels and take the threat more seriously? Was there a specific engineer or team that deserves the primary credit for the wooden fin solution, a name lost to history? Number 17. Was the attack actually a surprise to everyone in Washington? This is one of the most persistent and controversial questions about Pearl Harbor. The official story is that the United States was the victim of a completely unprovoked and unexpected attack. But for decades, some historians and researchers have argued that President Franklin D. Roosevelt and his top advisors knew an attack was coming and let it happen. The goal, they argue, was to have a justification to enter the war, something the American public was strongly against at the time. The evidence for this theory is circumstantial, but it is compelling. The most significant piece is the work of U.S. intelligence in breaking Japanese diplomatic codes. The project was called MAGIC. Throughout 1941, American codebreakers were reading secret messages between Tokyo and its embassies around the world. They knew that Japan was planning a major military operation. They knew that negotiations between the U.S. and Japan were a sham. On the evening of December 6th, the night before the attack, MAGIC intercepted a 14-part message from Tokyo to its embassy in Washington. The message was a final rejection of American peace proposals, and a clear signal that Japan was about to break off diplomatic relations. The final part, which instructed the ambassador to deliver the message at 1 p.m. Washington time on December 7th, just before dawn in Hawaii, was decoded late that night. There were other clues. There was the bomb plot message, a Japanese cable from their consulate in Honolulu to Tokyo, intercepted in September 1941. It requested a grid map of Pearl Harbor with precise locations of all the ships. U.S. intelligence analysts saw it, but its significance was apparently missed. There were also reports of a large Japanese fleet sailing under strict radio silence. In his controversial 1999 book, Day of Deceit: The Truth About FDR and Pearl Harbor, author Robert Stinnett argues that Roosevelt's administration had enough intelligence from multiple sources, including cracked naval codes, to know the Japanese fleet was heading for Hawaii. He claims they deliberately withheld this information from the commanders in Hawaii, Kimmel and Short. The mainstream historical view, as documented by authors like Gordon W. Prange and Roberta Wohlstetter in her book Pearl Harbor Warning and Decision, rejects this. They argue that while the U.S. had a lot of intelligence, it was a confusing jumble of signals. There was too much noise. The intelligence pointed to an attack in Southeast Asia, not Hawaii. No single message ever said, "We are going to attack Pearl Harbor on December 7th. The failure, in this view, was not a conspiracy, but a bureaucratic and analytical one. No one was able to connect all the dots in time. Roosevelt may have wanted to get into the war, but even his staunchest critics find it hard to believe he would have willingly sacrificed the Pacific Fleet and thousands of American lives to achieve that goal. So, what are the biggest questions that remain? Was there a back channel of communication between Roosevelt and British Prime Minister Winston Churchill that contained more specific warnings, as some have suggested? Were critical intelligence files related to Pearl Harbor intentionally destroyed after the war to hide a conspiracy? And if Roosevelt did know, who else in his inner circle was aware of the impending attack, and how did they justify their silence? The debate continues because there is no single document that provides a definitive answer. Number 16. What was the B signal the radar operators saw? On the morning of December 7th, there was a brand new experimental technology in place on the northern tip of Oahu. It was a mobile radar station at a place called Opana Point. Two Army privates, George Elliott Jr. and Joseph Lockhart, were on duty. Their shift was supposed to end at 7 a.m., but the truck to take them back to camp was late, so they kept the set on for a little extra practice. At 7:02 a.m., a huge blip appeared on their screen. It was bigger than anything either of them had ever seen before. It was a large group of aircraft about 137 miles to the north, heading straight for Oahu. Elliott was impressed. He called Lockhart over to look. They tracked the planes for a few minutes. They were closing fast. They knew they should report it. Lockhart called the information center at Fort Shafter. The switchboard operator had to find someone to take the call. The person who answered was Lieutenant Kermit Tyler. It was his second day on the job at the center. He had very little training on how the new radar system worked or what to look for. Lockhart reported the sighting. Large number of planes coming in from the north, 3 degrees east. Tyler considered the information. He knew that a flight of B-17 bombers was expected to arrive from California that morning. He assumed that's what the radar had picked up. He didn't ask how many planes Lockhart saw. He didn't ask how big the blip was. He just told Lockhart, "Well, don't worry about it." And that was that. The privates at Opana Point shut down their radar set at 7:45 a.m. 10 minutes later, the first bombs were falling on Pearl Harbor. The planes they had seen were the first wave of Japanese attackers. This incident is one of the great tragedies of the day. A clear warning, provided by cutting-edge technology, was dismissed by an inexperienced officer. The book Pearl Harbor Warning and Decision by Roberta Wohlstetter examines this failure in detail. She argues that the problem wasn't just Lieutenant Tyler. The entire system was flawed. There was no established procedure for what to do with a radar sighting like this. The information center was barely staffed on a Sunday morning. The link between the radar operators and the fighter pilots who could have responded was weak to non-existent. It was a system that was not ready for war. After the attack, Elliott and Lockhart were questioned extensively. Their story was a key part of the investigations. They were just two low-ranking soldiers who did their job correctly. They saw the enemy coming, they reported it, but the system failed them. The B-17s that Lieutenant Tyler was expecting did arrive during the attack. They were unarmed and low on fuel. They had to dodge Japanese fighters and American anti-aircraft fire to land at what was left of the airfields. What are the questions that still haunt this part of the story? What if a more experienced officer had been on duty at the information center? What if Tyler had simply asked, "How many planes are there?" The size of the formation, over 180 planes, was far larger than a flight of B-17s. Would that one question have changed his mind and triggered an alarm? And what was the psychological impact on Elliot and Lockhart, knowing they had seen the attack coming but were unable to stop it? Number 15. How did the Japanese fleet cross the Pacific in secret? The Japanese strike force, known as the Kido Butai, was the most powerful carrier fleet ever assembled. It consisted of 6 aircraft carriers, Akagi, Kaga, Soryu, Hiryu, Shokaku, and Zuikaku, with over 400 aircraft. It was supported by 2 battleships, 2 heavy cruisers, and a screen of destroyers and submarines. Pulling this force together and sailing it across 3,500 miles of the North Pacific without being detected was one of the greatest naval achievements and gambles in history. The secrecy began at home. The crews were not told their destination. Once the ships left port in late November 1941, a strict blackout was imposed. All radio transmissions were forbidden. The ships communicated using signal flags and lights. To fool American intelligence, the Japanese Navy generated fake radio traffic from near the shores of Japan, making it seem like the carriers were still in home waters. They even had some of the regular radio operators from the carriers transmit from land-based stations to maintain the illusion. The route chosen by Admiral Isoroku Yamamoto, the mastermind of the attack, was crucial. He selected a northern route across the Pacific. This route was rarely used in the winter because of its notoriously bad weather, with high seas and frequent storms. Merchant ships and military patrols avoided it. Yamamoto was counting on the fog and rough weather to hide his fleet from any chance encounters with other vessels or patrol planes. It was a huge risk. A severe storm could damage his ships or prevent him from launching his planes, but the gamble paid off. For almost 2 weeks, the massive fleet sailed eastward completely undetected. The book, a glorious page in our history, the Pearl Harbor attack, written from the Japanese perspective by the Japan War History Office, details the immense tension and precision of this voyage. The fleet had to be refueled at sea, a difficult operation in the best of conditions, let alone in the rough North Pacific. The pilots and crews were briefed on their final target only after they were well underway. The mood was a mix of excitement and anxiety. If they were discovered, even a day before the attack, the entire operation would be a failure. They would have to fight their way home against a fully alerted American fleet. But they were never spotted. Not by a ship, not by a plane. The first time the Americans knew the Japanese carriers were near Hawaii was when their planes appeared in the sky. What do we still not know about this incredible journey? Were there any close calls we don't know about? Did any civilian ships or neutral vessels spot the fleet and either fail to report it, or have their reports dismissed? How much did the Soviet Union's intelligence services know about the fleet's movements, and did they share any of that information with the United States? And what was the true level of dissent among the Japanese Naval Command about the incredible risk of sending their 6 best carriers on such a long and dangerous mission? Number 14 were their American heroes on the day of the attack. The story of Pearl Harbor is often told as a story of American defeat and unpreparedness, but it was also a day of incredible spontaneous heroism. With their ships sinking and their airfields burning, thousands of sailors, soldiers, and Marines fought back with whatever they could find. Their actions didn't change the outcome of the attack, but they demonstrated immense courage in the face of chaos. One of the most famous heroes was Dory Miller. He was a mess attendant, 3rd class on the USS West Virginia. As an African-American sailor in the then segregated Navy, his duties were limited to things like cooking and cleaning. He was not trained to fire a weapon. When the attack began, the West Virginia was hit by multiple torpedoes and bombs. Miller first helped carry his mortally wounded captain to a safer spot. Then, with no orders, he went to an unattended .50 caliber anti-aircraft machine gun. He had never fired one before, but he figured it out. He began firing at the Japanese planes, shooting down at least 2, and possibly more, before he was ordered to abandon ship. For his actions, Dory Miller was awarded the Navy Cross, the first African-American to receive this honor. His story is powerfully told in the book A Pledge of Silence by Flora J. Solomon. There were many others. On the USS Nevada, the only battleship to get underway during the attack, machinist Donald K. Ross single-handedly kept the ship's dynamos running in a smoke-filled, high-temperature compartment. He was blinded and overcome by fumes multiple times, but kept going back to his post, ensuring the ship had power. He was awarded the Medal of Honor. At the Kaneohe Bay Naval Air Station, Chief Ordnance Officer John Finn set up a machine gun in a completely exposed area and, despite being hit by shrapnel multiple times, continued to fire at Japanese planes for over 2 hours. He also received the Medal of Honor. Pilots scrambled to get their planes in the air. Lieutenants George Welch and Kenneth Taylor were two Army Air Forces pilots who managed to take off in their P-40 fighters from a small auxiliary airfield. They flew directly into the swarm of Japanese planes, shooting down at least 6 of them between them. They landed to rearm and refuel, and went back up again. On Ford Island, mechanics and sailors were cutting trapped men out of the hull of the capsized USS Oklahoma with acetylene torches. Chaplains gave last rites and comforted the wounded. These were individual acts of bravery, happening all over the harbor, often without any orders from senior officers. People just did what needed to be done. So what are the untold stories? How many other acts of heroism went unrecorded in the chaos of the day, with the witnesses killed moments later? Were there acts of quiet courage like the medics who worked under fire or the radio operators who stayed at their post that have been overlooked by history in favor of the more dramatic combat stories? And how did these moments of spontaneous resistance affect the Japanese pilots who were expecting to strike a completely passive and sleeping target? Number 13, what happened to the ships that were sunk? The image of Pearl Harbor is one of twisted, burning battleships sinking into the harbor. It looked like the complete destruction of the U.S. Pacific Fleet. But the attack was not as decisive a blow as it seemed. One of the most incredible and often overlooked stories of Pearl Harbor is the massive salvage operation that followed. It was one of the greatest feats of engineering in naval history. Because the attack happened in a shallow harbor, most of the ships were not lost forever in the deep ocean. They were sitting on the bottom, often with their decks and superstructures still above water. This made them accessible. The U.S. Navy immediately began a huge effort to repair, refloat, and rebuild the fleet. The work was led by Captain Homer N. Wallen. His team of divers, welders, engineers, and salvage workers faced incredible challenges. The waters were filled with oil, debris, and unexploded ordnance. The work on each ship was unique. For the USS California and USS West Virginia, which had sunk upright, divers had to patch the massive holes in their hulls. They used a technique of building huge wooden boxes called cofferdams around the damaged sections. Then they pumped the water out of the ship and it slowly refloated. The USS Oklahoma, which had capsized completely, was the biggest challenge. The salvage team attached 21 massive winches to the shore. Cables were run from the winches over the top of the hull and connected to the ship. Over a period of months, the winches slowly pulled the massive battleship upright. The process is documented in detail in the book Salvage of USS Oklahoma by the U.S. Navy Bureau of Ships. Of the 8 battleships damaged or sunk, 6 were eventually returned to service. The Nevada, which had beached itself to avoid blocking the harbor channel, was refloated and modernized. It went on to serve in both the Atlantic and Pacific, providing gunfire support for the Normandy landings. The California, West Virginia, Tennessee, Maryland, and Pennsylvania all fought in the final battles of the Pacific War. In a moment of historical irony, several of these ghosts of Pearl Harbor were present at the Battle of Surigao Strait in 1944, where they helped sink Japanese battleships in the last great battleship versus battleship engagement in history. Only 2 battleships were total losses, the USS Arizona, which was destroyed when a bomb ignited its forward magazine, and the Oklahoma, which was too old and badly damaged to be worth repairing. A third ship, the target ship USS Utah, also capsized and was left in the harbor. What do we still not know about this amazing salvage effort? What were the psychological effects on the divers and salvage workers who had to work inside these dark, flooded tombs, often encountering the remains of their former shipmates? Were there new engineering techniques or tools invented on the spot to solve unique salvage problems that have since become standard practice? And how much intelligence did the Japanese have about the success of the salvage operation? Did they believe for months or even years that the ships they had sunk were still at the bottom of the harbor? Number 12. Why weren't the American aircraft carriers at Pearl Harbor? The primary targets of the Japanese attack were the American aircraft carriers. The Japanese planners knew that the future of naval warfare was the carrier, not the battleship. Sinking the American carriers would have been a truly crippling blow, but on the morning of December 7th, all three of the Pacific Fleet's carriers were at sea. The USS Lexington was on its way to deliver planes to Midway Island. The USS Enterprise was on its way back from delivering planes to Wake Island. The USS Saratoga was on the west coast undergoing repairs. This has been called one of the luckiest coincidences in American military history. The Japanese sank the battleships, the ships of the past, but they missed the carriers, the ships of the future. The absence of the carriers is also a central piece of evidence for those who believe in the conspiracy theories that Roosevelt knew the attack was coming. They argue that Roosevelt and his advisors made sure the carriers were safely out of port. The book Infamy Pearl Harbor and Its Aftermath by historian John Toland explores this possibility, though it doesn't definitively conclude it's true. The official explanation is much more mundane. The carriers were out of the harbor on routine, scheduled missions. Their tensions with Japan were high, and the U.S. was trying to reinforce its small island outposts in the Pacific. Sending fighter planes to Wake and Midway was part of that strategy. Admiral Kimmel himself made the decision to send the carriers on these missions. There was nothing unusual about it. In fact, the USS Enterprise was scheduled to arrive back in Pearl Harbor on December 6th, the day before the attack. It was delayed by bad weather. If not for a storm, it would have been tied up at Ford Island on Sunday morning, a prime target for Japanese torpedo planes. The survival of the carriers changed the entire course of the war in the Pacific. With the battleship fleet destroyed, the carriers were the only offensive weapons the U.S. had left. They were forced to adopt the new style of naval warfare, centered on carrier-based air power much faster than they would have otherwise. Just 6 months later, at the Battle of Midway, the carriers Enterprise, Hornet, which had come to the Pacific after the attack, and Yorktown, which had been badly damaged but was quickly repaired, ambushed the Japanese fleet and sank 4 of the 6 Japanese carriers that had attacked Pearl Harbor. It was a turning point in the war, a victory made possible only because the American carriers had survived the initial attack. What are the lingering questions about this incredible stroke of luck? Is there any written evidence, a logbook entry, or a personal letter that suggests the carrier missions were deliberately planned to keep them out of harm's way? How much did Japanese intelligence know about the carriers' schedules? Their spy in Honolulu, Takeo Yoshikawa, had provided detailed reports on the ships in the harbor, but did he know about the departure of the carriers? And what would have happened if the Enterprise hadn't been delayed by the storm? If Japan had sunk 1 or 2 carriers at Pearl Harbor, could they have won the Battle of Midway and changed the course of the war? Number 11. How did life change for Japanese Americans in Hawaii? The attack on Pearl Harbor had an immediate and devastating impact on the Japanese American community. In Hawaii, people of Japanese ancestry made up nearly 40% of the population. They were an integral part of the island's economy and society. In an instant, they were viewed with suspicion and fear by many of their neighbors. The FBI and military intelligence immediately began rounding up community leaders, priests, teachers, and anyone else deemed a potential threat. About 1,500 Japanese Americans in Hawaii were arrested and sent to internment camps on the mainland. But what happened in Hawaii was very different from what happened on the U.S. mainland. On the West Coast, over 110,000 people of Japanese descent, most of them American citizens, were forcibly removed from their homes and incarcerated in camps for the duration of the war. This mass internment did not happen in Hawaii. The reason was purely practical. The Japanese American population was simply too large and too vital to the Hawaiian economy. Interning almost 40% of the population would have crippled the islands. The military governor of Hawaii, General Delos Emmons, resisted pressure from Washington to implement a mass internment policy. He understood that it was not only unjust, but also logistically impossible and economically catastrophic. His leadership is detailed in the book Hawaii Goes to War by DeSoto Brown. Despite this, life for Japanese Americans in Hawaii became very difficult. They were subjected to curfews, travel restrictions, and constant surveillance. Their Japanese language schools and newspapers were shut down. They had to prove their loyalty over and over again. One of the most remarkable ways they did this was through military service. Thousands of young Nisei, second-generation Japanese Americans, volunteered to fight for the United States. At first they were rejected, but eventually the U.S. Army formed the 100th Infantry Battalion and the 442nd Regimental Combat Team, composed almost entirely of Japanese Americans, many of them from Hawaii. These units were sent to fight in Europe and became the most decorated units of their size in U.S. military history. They fought to prove their loyalty to a country that doubted them. The experience of Japanese Americans in Hawaii during the war is a complex story of prejudice, pragmatism, and patriotism. While they were spared the mass internment of their counterparts on the mainland, they lived under a cloud of suspicion in their own homes. Their story is a powerful reminder of the civil liberties that can be threatened during times of national crisis. What do we still not know? How many individual acts of discrimination or, conversely, of kindness and support from non-Japanese neighbors went unrecorded? What was the true extent of the debate within the Roosevelt administration about whether to push for mass internment in Hawaii despite the logistical challenges? And how did the wartime experience fundamentally change the social and political landscape of Hawaii, setting the stage for its eventual statehood? Number 10. Were there women who played a crucial role? The story of Pearl Harbor is usually told through the eyes of men sailors, pilots, and commanders. But women were there too, and they played vital roles as witnesses, first responders, and professionals. Their stories are an essential part of the day. The most visible group were the military nurses. At the Army Hospital at Schofield Barracks and the Navy Hospital at Pearl Harbor, nurses found themselves in the middle of a war zone. They were not prepared for the scale of the carnage. The chief nurse at the Army's Tripler Hospital, First Lieutenant Annie G. Fox, was one of them. As the first casualties started to arrive, she organized the hospital's response, directing staff, setting up makeshift operating rooms, and working tirelessly to save lives amidst the chaos. For her outstanding performance of duty and meritorious acts of extraordinary fidelity, she was the first woman in U.S. history to be awarded the Purple Heart for combat. Her story, and others like it, are documented in books like And I Was There, Pearl Harbor, and Midway, Breaking the Secrets by Rear Admiral Edwin T. Layton, who noted the crucial role of all personnel on that day. Civilian women also found themselves on the front lines. Cornelia Fort was a civilian flight instructor in Honolulu. On the morning of December 7th, she was in the air with a student practicing takeoffs and landings near Pearl Harbor. She saw a military plane flying erratically towards her. She grabbed the controls from her student and pulled up sharply to avoid a mid-air collision. It was then that she saw the red circle, the meatball, insignia on the wing. It was a Japanese plane. She looked down and saw smoke rising from Pearl Harbor. She and her student were being shot at. She managed to land the plane safely at the airport, dodging strafing Japanese fighters. She was one of the first American pilots to encounter the Japanese aerial armada. There were also the women who worked as telephone operators, like the staff at the Mutual Telephone Company in Honolulu. As the attack began, they were flooded with calls. They stayed at their posts, working to keep the lines of communication open for the military and emergency services, even as bombs fell nearby. Their work was essential for coordinating the response to the attack. These women were not soldiers, but their sense of duty and their courage under fire were just as real. So, what are the stories we haven't heard? How many civilian women, wives of military personnel living on or near the bases, performed first aid and helped the wounded in the first critical minutes of the attack? What were the long-term psychological impacts on the nurses who had to deal with such horrific injuries with limited supplies? And how did the shared experience of the attack change the role and perception of women in the very male-dominated society of pre-war Hawaii? Number 9. What did the average person in Honolulu experience? For most civilians in Honolulu, Sunday, December 7th, 1941, started as a beautiful, peaceful morning. People were going to church, playing with their kids, or just enjoying a lazy day off. The sounds of explosions from the direction of Pearl Harbor were at first dismissed. The military often conducted exercises on Sunday mornings, but soon the smoke was too thick, the explosions too loud. And then the planes came. Some Japanese pilots, after dropping their bombs on military targets, flew over Honolulu, strafing streets and houses. The reality of the attack hit home in brutal ways. An anti-aircraft shell fired by the U.S. military fell into the neighborhood of Liliha, hitting a house and killing 3 people. A Japanese bomb missed its military target and hit the Lunalilo School, which was being used as a temporary infirmary. Another bomb hit a garage, starting a fire that spread to several homes. In total, 68 civilians were killed and hundreds were wounded in and around Honolulu. The civilian experience is chronicled in Scott C.S. Stone's book, Pearl Harbor, The Day of Infamy, an illustrated history. Panic and confusion spread quickly. Radio stations at first broadcast music, then switched to urgent, confusing messages. Stay off the streets. Do not use your telephone. Rumors flew. The Japanese were landing on the beaches. Paratroopers were dropping from the sky. People rushed to stores to buy food and supplies. The city was placed under martial law that very day. A strict blackout was imposed that night. The vibrant, tourist-friendly city of Honolulu was transformed into a militarized zone overnight. For the civilians, the attack was not a distant news report. It was a terrifying personal experience. They saw the planes overhead. They heard the screams. They tended to the wounded. A local dairy farmer used his trucks to transport injured sailors to the hospital. Its blood donation centers were overwhelmed with volunteers. The community, a diverse mix of native Hawaiians, Japanese, Chinese, Filipino, and white Americans, came together in the face of the attack. They showed incredible resilience, but the fear and uncertainty would last for months, even years. What are the untold civilian stories? How did families cope with the fear of another attack in the days and weeks that followed? What were the interactions between civilians and the military as martial law was imposed on the city? And are there personal diaries or letters from ordinary citizens of Honolulu from that day that have never been published, containing unique and personal perspectives on what it was like to watch your world suddenly catch fire? Number 8. How did the Japanese pilots view the attack? To the Americans, the Japanese pilots were faceless aggressors, but they were individuals with their own training, fears, and motivations. For them, the attack on Pearl Harbor was the culmination of years of intense, grueling training. They were the elite of the Imperial Japanese Navy. The pilot who led the first wave, Mitsuo Fuchida, wrote a detailed account of the attack in his memoir For That One Day. He describes the mood on the carrier Akagi in the hours before takeoff. It was calm, professional, and determined. The pilots believed they were fighting for the survival of their nation. They had been told that the United States was strangling Japan with an oil embargo and that this was a war of liberation, to free Asia from Western colonial powers. They saw the U.S. Pacific Fleet as a dagger pointed at the throat of Japan. Their mission, as they saw it, was a necessary and just act of self-defense. Fuchida described the view as they approached Oahu. The island was shrouded in clouds, and he worried they would have to call off the attack. But then the clouds broke, and he saw the American fleet sleeping in the harbor below. It was a perfect sight, exactly as their intelligence reports had described. He gave the famous signal, Tora, 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 Tiger, 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 which meant they had achieved complete surprise. He then watched as his fellow pilots executed their attacks with deadly precision. He described it as a tactical masterpiece. But he also expressed a sense of awe at the scale of the destruction he was witnessing. Not all pilots felt the same way. Some expressed regret and sadness in their diaries and letters home. They were warriors, but they were also human. They knew the cost of what they were doing. After the attack, as they flew back to their carriers, the mood was one of elation and relief. They had succeeded beyond their wildest dreams. They had lost only 29 planes, but some of the more thoughtful leaders, including the overall commander Admiral Yamamoto, were not so optimistic. Yamamoto famously wrote that he feared all they had done was to awaken a sleeping giant and fill him with a terrible resolve. He was right. Many of the pilots who flew at Pearl Harbor would not survive the war that followed. What do we still not know about the pilots' experiences? Are there any surviving diaries or journals from the enlisted flight crewmen, not just the famous commanders? That could offer a different perspective. How did the pilots who were shot down and survived, like Kazuo Sakamaki, the midget submarine pilot, reconcile their mission with their capture? And what were the private conversations among the pilots on the long journey home? Was there any debate or second guessing about the targets they had hit, or the ones they had missed, like the fuel depots? Number 7, was the attack really a military success for Japan? In the short term, the attack on Pearl Harbor was a stunning tactical victory for Japan. They achieved their primary objective to neutralize the U.S. Pacific Fleet. This gave them a window of about 6 months to expand their empire in Southeast Asia and the Pacific without American interference. They seized the Philippines, Singapore, the Dutch East Indies, and a string of islands. They did all this with minimal losses. The Pearl Harbor attack was, from a purely military execution standpoint, one of the most successful surprise attacks in history. But in the long term, the attack was a catastrophic strategic failure. It was a failure of political understanding. The Japanese leaders, particularly those in the military, completely misjudged the American people. They believed that a devastating blow like Pearl Harbor would shatter American morale. They thought the U.S., a nation they saw as soft and isolationist, would not have the will to fight a long and bloody war across the Pacific. They hoped the U.S. would negotiate a peace that would leave Japan in control of its new empire. This was a massive miscalculation. The attack did the exact opposite. It united a divided America overnight. Before December 7th, there was a huge anti-war movement in the United States. After the attack, that disappeared. The slogan, "Remember Pearl Harbor," became a powerful rallying cry. The attack galvanized American industry and society. The sleeping giant that Admiral Yamamoto feared had been awakened. The United States would go on to build a military machine that Japan could not possibly compete with. The U.S. outproduced Japan in aircraft, ships, and every other category of war material by a massive margin. Historian H.P. Wilmot, in his book The Barrier and the Javelin, argues that the attack, while brilliant in its execution, sealed Japan's ultimate doom. Furthermore, the attack missed the most important strategic targets. As discussed before, they missed the aircraft carriers. They missed the submarine base, and they missed the fuel oil storage tanks. By leaving the infrastructure of Pearl Harbor intact, they allowed it to become the crucial forward base for the American war effort in the Pacific. So, while they won the battle on December 7th, they also started a war they could not win. It was a perfect tactical victory that led to an absolute strategic defeat. So, what are the big what-ifs that remain? What if Japan had not attacked Pearl Harbor and had instead focused solely on British and Dutch colonies in Asia? Would the United States have entered the war, or would the isolationist sentiment have prevailed? Was there a significant faction within the Japanese government that argued against the Pearl Harbor attack, and how close did they come to stopping it? And did any Japanese leaders, even in the first flush of victory, privately express the same fears as Yamamoto, recognizing that they had started a war that was too big for them to finish? Number 6, who was the Japanese spy in Honolulu? The incredible precision of the Japanese attack was not just a matter of good planning and training. It was also based on excellent intelligence. For months leading up to the attack, a Japanese spy was operating in Honolulu, providing Tokyo with detailed information about the U.S. Pacific Fleet. His name was Takeo Yoshikawa. He was a young naval intelligence officer who arrived in Honolulu in the spring of 1941 under the cover of a junior diplomat at the Japanese consulate. Yoshikawa was the perfect spy for the job. He was charming, athletic, and spoke excellent English. He spent his days gathering information. He would take tourist flights over Pearl Harbor, memorizing the locations of the ships. He would hike the hills overlooking the harbor to get a better view. He would chat with American sailors in local bars. He even took a small boat and sailed around the harbor, taking notes. He was meticulous. He kept track of which ships were in port and which were out at sea. He noted their routines, their patrol schedules, and the state of their readiness. His most important contribution was the bomb plot message. Tokyo had asked him to divide Pearl Harbor into a grid. He was to use this grid to report the exact location of every ship in the harbor. This information was crucial for the Japanese pilots. It allowed them to know exactly where to find their primary targets, the battleships, which were usually moored along Battleship Row. The American intelligence intercepted and decoded these messages, but they failed to grasp their true significance. They thought it was just the Japanese being overly thorough. They didn't realize they were looking at a target list. The story of Yoshikawa is detailed in the book Operation Z, which describes the Japanese planning for the attack. But Yoshikawa sent his final report on December 6th, the evening before the attack. He confirmed that the battleships were in the harbor, but the aircraft carriers were not. This information was relayed to Nagumo's fleet. After the attack, Yoshikawa destroyed all his spy equipment and waited. He was eventually arrested by the FBI, along with the other Japanese consular staff, but they didn't know he was a spy. They thought he was just a diplomat. He was eventually repatriated to Japan in a prisoner exchange. His true role was not revealed until after the war. What are the remaining mysteries about Yoshikawa's espionage? Did he have any local assets or informants who helped him gather information? The official story is that he worked alone, but is that true? How close did American counterintelligence, like the FBI, come to discovering him before the attack? And what was his life like after the war? He was not celebrated as a hero in Japan. For some, he was a painful reminder of a disastrous war. Did he ever express regret for his role in starting the conflict? Number 5. What happened to the commanders Kimmel and Short in the end? The careers of Admiral Husband E. Kimmel and Lieutenant General Walter C. Short were destroyed by the attack on Pearl Harbor. 10 days after the attack, they were relieved of their commands. In January 1942, the first official investigation, the Roberts Commission, found them guilty of dereliction of duty. They were publicly shamed and became the faces of the American failure. Both men were forced to retire from the military at reduced ranks. They spent the rest of their lives trying to clear their names. They argued correctly that they had not been provided with all the available intelligence from Washington. They maintained that they had done the best they could with the information and resources they had. They requested a public court-martial where they could present their side of the story and cross-examine witnesses. But the government, citing wartime security, refused. There were several more investigations during and after the war, some of which were more sympathetic to the commanders. The Naval Court of Inquiry in 1944, for example, found that Kimmel had not been derelict, but the official blame remained. The debate over their responsibility has continued for decades. Their families and supporters have campaigned tirelessly for their exoneration. Historians like Gordon Prange, while critical of their lack of imagination, concluded that the blame was widespread and systemic, not isolated to two men. The book, The Final Secret of Pearl Harbor, by Rear Admiral Robert Theobald, who was in the Pacific Fleet at the time, was one of the first to argue that they were scapegoats in a larger conspiracy. Finally, in 1999, the U.S. Senate passed a non-binding resolution that exonerated Kimmel and Short. The resolution stated that they had performed their duties competently and professionally, and that the blame should be broadly shared. It recommended that they be posthumously restored to their full 4-star ranks. Both men had died long before this, Kimmel in 1968 and Short in 1949. The Department of Defense has never officially acted on the Senate's recommendation, so while their reputations have been largely restored in the eyes of history, the official record has not been fully corrected. Their story is a cautionary tale about how institutions can sacrifice individuals to protect themselves. What are the final unanswered questions in their case? Is there any document still classified in the archives of the War Department or the White House that would definitively prove that critical intelligence was deliberately withheld from them? Why has the Department of Defense resisted the Senate's recommendation to posthumously restore their ranks? And if they were not primarily to blame, who was? Does the ultimate responsibility lie with their superiors in Washington, like Chief of Naval Operations Harold Stark or Army Chief of Staff George Marshall, or even with President Roosevelt himself? Number 4. Did the attack use any new or secret weapons? Beyond the specially modified torpedoes, the Japanese attack on Pearl Harbor showcased several other pieces of advanced military technology that surprised the Americans. The Japanese Naval Air Force was, at that moment, arguably the best in the world. Their pilots were highly trained and their planes were superb. The most famous of these planes was the Mitsubishi A6M Zero fighter. When the Zero first appeared, it was a shock to Allied pilots. It was incredibly fast and maneuverable. It could outclimb and turn any American fighter plane in the sky at the time, including the Army's P-40 Warhawk and the Navy's F-4F Wildcat. It had a very long range, allowing it to escort bombers on deep strikes. The Zero achieved this performance by being built for lightness. It had very little armor to protect the pilot or self-sealing fuel tanks. This made it vulnerable to damage, a flaw that the Americans would later exploit. But in the early days of the war, the Zero dominated the skies. The Japanese also used highly effective dive bombers, the Aichi D-3A Vol, and torpedo bombers, the Nakajima B-5N Kate. The Kate was particularly advanced. It was faster and carried a larger payload than its American counterparts. It was the Kate bombers that dropped the modified torpedoes that sank the battleships, and they also served as high-level bombers. 1-8 Kate, flying at high altitude, is believed to have dropped the armor-piercing bomb that penetrated the deck of the USS Arizona and ignited its forward magazine, causing the catastrophic explosion that destroyed the ship. The book Eagles of Mitsubishi, The Story of the Zero Fighter by Jiro Horikoshi, the plane's chief designer, gives insight into the philosophy behind its creation. The other secret weapon was the Type A Ko-Hayotiki class midget submarine. These were 2-man, 78-foot-long electric submarines, each armed with 2 torpedoes. The plan for them to sneak into the harbor and attack the battleships was a high-risk, high-reward strategy. It was largely a failure. Of the 5 subs launched, none are confirmed to have successfully fired their torpedoes at a target. 1 was sunk by the USS Ward, 1 ran aground, 1 was found in the harbor after the attack, and 2 disappeared. But their presence shows the Japanese commitment to using innovative and unconventional tactics. The attack on Pearl Harbor was not just a sneak attack, it was a technological showcase. What do we still not know about these weapons? How did the Japanese manage to keep the true capabilities of the Zero fighter such a closely guarded secret from Western intelligence agencies? Were there any other experimental weapons or tactics that the Japanese considered using at Pearl Harbor but decided against? And what was the ultimate fate of the 2 midget submarines that were never found? Did they escape the harbor and try to rendezvous with their mother's subs, or are their wrecks still lying undiscovered somewhere on the seabed off the coast of Oahu? Number 3, how long did the attack actually last? The attack on Pearl Harbor feels like an event that lasted all day, a day of infamy. But the actual combat phase of the attack was surprisingly short. The first wave of 183 Japanese planes struck at 7:55 a.m. They focused on the battleships and the airfields. The second wave of 171 planes arrived around 8:50 a.m. Their targets were other ships and shipyard facilities. By 9:55 a.m., about 2 hours after it began, the last of the Japanese planes had turned and were heading back to their carriers. By 1 p.m., the Japanese fleet was sailing for home. In those 2 hours, the damage was immense. Over 2,400 Americans were killed. Nearly 1,200 were wounded. 18 ships were sunk or seriously damaged. Over 180 aircraft were destroyed. But the brevity of the attack is important. It shows the incredible efficiency and planning of the Japanese military. It also explains why they didn't hit more targets. With only 2 waves, they had to prioritize. Battleships and planes came first. The things that would prove more important in the long run, the fuel depots, the submarine base, the repair yards, were secondary targets that would have been hit by a third wave. The psychological impact, however, lasted much longer. The smoke from the burning ships, especially the USS Arizona, hung over the harbor for days. The rescue and recovery efforts were grim and took weeks. The sense of vulnerability and fear lingered for the rest of the war. The short, sharp shock of the attack created a lasting trauma, both for the survivors and for the nation as a whole. The attack is documented almost minute by minute in Walter Lord's classic book, Day of Infamy, which is based on hundreds of interviews with American and Japanese participants. The 2-hour window was a period of absolute chaos and terror. For the men on the ships and the airfields, it must have felt like an eternity. Time stretched and compressed. A sailor on the USS Nevada described seeing a torpedo in the water, and it seemed to be moving in slow motion. A pilot trying to get to his plane said everything felt frantic and sped up. The short duration of the attack highlights the fact that this was not a sustained battle, but a sudden, overwhelming raid designed to do maximum damage in minimum time and then escape. So what are the lingering questions about this timeline? If Nagumo had been less cautious, could he have rearmed his planes and launched a third wave that same day? How long would that have taken, and would it have been before nightfall? How did the speed and efficiency of the attack compare to the Japanese military's own war games and predictions? Did it go better or worse than they expected? And for the survivors, how did their perception of time during those 2 hours affect their memories and their ability to recall the events accurately later on? Number 2, what was the 14th part of the final message? The final Japanese diplomatic message to the United States, the one that formally broke off negotiations, was sent in 14 parts. American intelligence, through the MAGIC program, intercepted and decoded the first 13 parts on the evening of December 6th. They made it clear that Japan was rejecting the American position, but they didn't declare war. President Roosevelt read them and reportedly said, "This means war." But the crucial final part, the 14th part, didn't arrive until the morning of December 7th. This 14th part was the key. It stated that it was impossible to reach an agreement and that Japan was ending the talks. After this came a separate, very short message. It instructed the Japanese ambassador to deliver the entire 14-part message to the American Secretary of State, Cordell Hull, at exactly 1 p.m. Washington time. That was 7:30 a.m. in Hawaii. The timing was deliberate. The Japanese government wanted to officially break off relations just before the attack began, so they could claim they hadn't struck without warning. But things went wrong. The Japanese embassy in Washington was slow. The typist had trouble decoding and preparing the final document. And the ambassador, Admiral Kichisaburo Nomura, didn't get to see Secretary Hull until after 2 p.m. Washington time. By then, the attack had been underway for over an hour. When Hull received the message, he already knew about the attack. He famously told the Japanese ambassadors, "In all my 50 years of public service, I have never seen a document that was more crowded with infamous falsehoods and distortions." Meanwhile, in Washington, American intelligence had decoded the 14th part, and the 1 p.m. delivery instruction early that morning. An Army officer, Colonel Rufus Bratton, realized the significance of the timing. This passing 1 p.m. on the East Coast was dawn over the Pacific. He tried frantically to get a warning out to all American military commands in the Pacific, including Hawaii. But it was a Sunday morning. He had trouble finding senior officers. When he finally got approval from General George Marshall, he sent a warning. But because of atmospheric interference with Army radio, the message to Hawaii was sent via a commercial telegraph service, Western Union. It was delivered by a motorcycle messenger to General Short's headquarters during the attack. It was not read until hours later. This series of delays and near misses is detailed in Roberto Wolstedter's Pearl Harbor Warning and Decision. What do we still not know for sure? Why was the Japanese embassy in Washington so inefficient on that crucial day? Was it simple incompetence, or was there an element of passive resistance from diplomats who knew the message meant war? And what about the final warning from Washington? Could it have been sent faster? Was there any way to get it to Kimmel and Short in the hour or so between its decoding and the start of the attack? It remains one of the most frustrating what-ifs of the entire event. Number 1. Did the attack have to happen? This is the biggest question of all. Was the war between Japan and the United States inevitable? Or was there a diplomatic off-ramp that both sides missed? In 1941, the two countries were on a collision course. Japan had invaded China and was pushing into Southeast Asia. The United States, along with Britain and the Netherlands, had responded with an embargo, most critically on oil. Japan's military machine and its entire economy depended on imported oil. The embargo was an existential threat. From the Japanese perspective, they had two choices: give in to American demands and retreat from their conquest, which was politically impossible for the military-dominated government, or go to war to seize the oil-rich territories of the Dutch East Indies. To do that, they felt they had to eliminate the threat of the U.S. Pacific Fleet. That was the logic that led to Pearl Harbor. But there were voices on both sides calling for a different path. In Japan, there were diplomats and even some naval officers who feared a war with the United States. They knew they could not win a long conflict. In the United States, there were officials who argued for a more flexible approach, perhaps a temporary agreement that would de-escalate the crisis. The book The Road to Pearl Harbor by Herbert Feist chronicles the complex and ultimately failed negotiations. The final American proposal to Japan, known as the Hull Note, delivered in late November 1941, was very firm. It demanded that Japan withdraw all its forces from China and Indochina. To the Americans, this was a statement of principle. To the Japanese, it was an ultimatum. They saw it as a demand for their complete humiliation. It was this note that convinced the government in Tokyo that diplomacy had failed and that the time for war had come. Could things have been different? What if the United States had offered a modus vivendi, a temporary agreement to ease the oil embargo in exchange for a partial Japanese withdrawal? Such a proposal was discussed in the State Department but was ultimately rejected, partly due to pressure from China and Britain. What if Japan's more moderate political leaders had been able to stand up to the military? The tragedy of Pearl Harbor is not just the attack itself, but the massive failure of diplomacy and imagination that preceded it. It was a war that neither side's leaders truly wanted in the abstract, but one that both sides' actions made inevitable. So, what are the ultimate unknowns? Was there a specific moment in the 1941 negotiations where a single different decision by either Roosevelt or Japanese Prime Minister Hideki Tojo could have averted war? How much of the final decision was driven by national honor and cultural misunderstandings rather than pure strategic calculation? And looking back, could a different set of global circumstances have allowed for a peaceful resolution? Or was the fundamental conflict between a rising Japanese empire and an established American power in the Pacific simply too great to be solved with words? We may never know.